Warm welcome, audience. What's time there from where you're watching it? In the depths of Mount Olympus, where clouds kissed eternal flame, the god of war took his first breath. Ars, son of mighty Zeus and regal hero, was born not in peace, but in thunder. The air trembled when his cry echoed through the heavens, a cry that spoke of storms yet to come. Even as an infant, his eyes burned with the hue of battle, crimson like blood, fierce like fire. Zeus looked down upon his child and saw both glory and destruction. Hera, proud yet wary, feared the destiny that followed him like a shadow. Unlike Apollo, who shone with wisdom, or Athena, who mastered strategy, Ars embodied chaos itself. He was not the calm before battle, he was the storm that devoured it. The fates spun his thread with hands trembling in both awe and dread. He grew swiftly, trained among the clang of divine weapons, forged by Hephaestus himself. His laughter was thunder, his footsteps echoed like marching legions. Every breath he took summoned visions of war and conquest. When other gods gathered in golden halls, Ars preferred the edge of Olympus, watching mortal kingdoms rise and fall. He envied their wars, their screams, their victories soaked in blood. Battlefields called to him like lullabies to restless children. He saw beauty in broken shields, and poetry in the cries of warriors. But even gods must learn restraint, a lesson Ars never mastered. He longed for glory, not peace, for chaos, not order. And soon the world would know his hunger. The first war Ars joined was not among mortals, but among gods. The giants had risen, monstrous beings born from Earth's rage. The heavens shook as Ars led the charge beside Athena and Zeus. Spears collided with roars, and the skies burned red. Ars fought like madness incarnate, unstoppable and brutal. He tore through giants with divine fury, his blade singing hymns of slaughter. But victory came with scorn. Athena despised his reckless thirst for blood. Where she saw order, he saw chaos. Where she sought justice, he sought destruction. Their rivalry became legend, a clash between mind and might. Zeus watched silently, torn between pride and fear for his son. As centuries passed, Ars grew more distant from Olympus. He descended among mortals unseen but ever present in their wars. From the Bronze Age to the rise of Sparta, his name echoed through chants of warriors. They built altars drenched in blood, calling for his blessing before battle. And he answered, always. When the first spear was lifted, when the first war cry rose, Ars was there, invisible but felt, divine yet cruel. He whispered courage into trembling hearts and rage into peaceful ones. His presence twisted men into monsters of valor and horror alike. Kings prayed for his favor, but few could bear it. For every victory he gave, he demanded blood tenfold. No war was ever just in his eyes, only glorious. Mortals both feared and adored him, seeing in him what they desired most, power. Yet Ars was never loyal to any side. He loved war itself, not the warriors. He watched them burn cities and slaughter kin, smiling at the flames. To him, peace was decay, war was life. The poets cursed his name, the soldiers praised it. Temples were razed, then destroyed in his name. Ars was the breath of every conflict, the heart of every weapon forged. When mortals wept, he remained unmoved. When heroes fell, he called it destiny. But behind his divine pride, a strange emptiness grew. He began to question the purpose of endless battle. If war was eternal, was victory ever real? Even gods can feel the burden of their essence. Ars stood upon a battlefield one dusk, gazing upon the fallen. Men and women lay still, their armor cracked, their dreams silent. The smoke curled toward the heavens like prayers that would never be answered. And for the first time Ars felt stillness, a whisper of sorrow. He did not understand it. Was this regret? Was this weakness? No. He told himself it was honor. But deep down a seed of doubt was sown. He began to notice the tears of widows, the cries of children left behind. Even gods cannot escape the gaze of humanity. Ars watched as mortals rebuilt what he had destroyed, their determination stronger than their fear. He saw that after every war came peace, and from peace, war again. The cycle fascinated him, confused him, perhaps even mocked him. He tried to understand love, but only found passion tangled with pain. And in that chaos of emotion, he met her, Aphrodite. the goddess of beauty, love, and irresistible charm. She was everything Ars was not, calm, radiant, tender, yet she saw in him a spark that thrilled her divine heart. Their union was forbidden yet fated, emerging of fire and silk. From their love came children who embodied both war and desire. But even love could not chain the god of war. He would leave Aphrodite for months, years, lost to bloodlust. Still, she waited, for beauty often dances with destruction. As ages passed, the world evolved, but Ars never changed. He was present in every empire's rise and fall. In the clashing swords of Troy, his laughter echoed. In the cries of Roman soldiers, his shadow loomed. To the Greeks, he was feared. To the Romans, he was revered as Mars, protector of empires. He watched his name transform, yet his essence remained the same. Ars was eternal, not a god of victory, but of struggle. Every time humanity fought, he was reborn. And though he ruled no kingdom, his domain was infinite. For as long as there would be conflict, there would be Ars. And so his saga began, written not in ink but in blood. The god of war had taken his throne not in Olympus, but in the hearts of men. The drums of war beat once more, echoing through eternity. And the universe listened. The world of mortals entered its age of heroes, and Ars watched from the burning clouds above with an unblinking gaze. Kingdoms rose like flames from dry earth, and the scent of glory spread across the lands. For centuries, Ars had guided nameless warriors, but now he saw individuals burn brighter than nations, men whose courage could rival divine wrath. Achilles, Hector, Perseus, Heracles, names that would echo through eternity. All carried fragments of his spirit. He was the whisper in their veins, the heat behind their fury, the god who gave purpose to their pain. Yet, amid their triumphs, Ars longed for something greater than scattered battles. He craved a war that would shake the world, one that would make even Olympus tremble. That moment came when a single act of desire set the world ablaze, the abduction of Helen, the spark that birthed the Trojan War. When the first Greek ships left their shores, Ars felt the pulse of destiny throb in his immortal chest. The air grew thick with anticipation, and he could hear the drums of war beating long before the first spear struck Trojan soil. 10,000 sails stretched across the wine-dark sea, and beneath them marched men who would make history or become dust in its making. The gods watched, divided like a shattered crown. Hera and Athena stood with Greece, cold and strategic, while Ars, defiant and consumed by love for Aphrodite, chose Troy. Love and war, to forces destined to destroy all they touched, stood together once more. As the Greeks landed and the first cries of death rose into the sky, Ars descended, cloaked in mortal form, unseen yet commanding. Among the Trojan soldiers, his presence ignited courage and madness alike. Men who once trembled now fought like beasts possessed. Each swing of his blade left a red mist in the air, each strike a hymn to destruction. The god of war had joined the fray, not as a god seeking worship, but as a flame feeding on chaos. Yet fate would not allow him unchecked glory. Athena, ever the strategist, descended as well, her wisdom a counterweight to his fury. When Ars saw her, memories of ancient rivalries blazed anew. They met on the battlefield, divine against divine, fury against precision. The ground split beneath their feet, and the heavens shook as they clashed. Ars charged like a hurricane of blades, his roar louder than thunder, but Athena moved like calm within the storm. She parried every strike, turned his rage against him, and with one piercing thrust, her spear found his side. The cry of Ars echoed across the world, a sound of divine pain and pride shattering together. His blood, molten and bright, spilled upon the earth, seeding new wars yet unborn. The mortals fled before their fury, and even Zeus, watching from Olympus, grew weary of his children's eternal feud. With thunderous command, he ended the battle and sent them both away. Wounded and humiliated, Ars returned to Olympus, his body healing but his pride bleeding still. Hera's words of comfort fell like rain on stone. No warmth could cool the fire of his shame. In rage, he shattered his weapons, vowing never again to bow to strategy or reason. Let Athena have her wisdom, he snarled. I will be the truth they cannot deny, the chaos they crave. And so he abandoned Olympus once more, descending among mortals, unseen and restless. He wandered from land to land, Egypt's deserts, Scythia's frozen plains, Persia's crimson battlefields, and wherever men raised their swords, his spirit followed. He whispered courage into trembling hearts and vengeance into grieving ones. With every war, he felt his power surge again, his essence reborn through mortal hands. But no victory filled the emptiness Athena's spear had left within him. He began to wonder if even gods could truly win when war itself never ends. As centuries passed, mortals changed, but war did not. Ars watched as kingdoms crumbled and new empires rose from the ashes. The Greeks who had once sung his name faded into memory, replaced by Romans who built their world upon discipline and order. They still prayed for victory, still spilled blood in his honor, but now they called him by another name, Mars. The Romans reshaped his image, turning his fury into valor, his chaos into control. To them, he was not destruction but duty, not rage but honor. And Ars, unseen, watched as his own essence was rewritten. In this new world, war was no longer worshipped as madness but managed as craft. Soldiers fought with rhythm, legions moved as one, and even slaughter was measured with logic. Ars, once the storm, now found himself overshadowed by his own reflection, Mars, the god of calculated conquest. Still, Ars lingered unseen in marble temples and iron hearts. He walked the streets of Rome disguised as a wanderer, hearing priests praise Mars the protector. Protector, he whispered bitterly, as if the word itself were poison. To him, peace through strength was blasphemy, a cage forged for fire. Yet, he could not deny the power of this new order. The Romans conquered not through rage, but through discipline, and their triumphs echoed across the earth. In their victories, Ars found a strange satisfaction, not joy, but recognition that war had evolved, yet still belonged to him. When Roman generals dreamed before battle, it was Ars, not Mars, who appeared in their sleep, towering, blood-soaked, reminding them that beneath their honor lay the same primal hunger. In one such dream, he appeared before a great Roman commander. The man bowed, calling him Mars, the shield of Rome. Ares' laughter shook the dream. "I am no shield," he said. "I am the storm behind it." The general woke with trembling hands and led his army to victory the next day, never knowing which god truly answered him. It was then Ars understood names were mortal, but war was divine. He did not need temples or prayers. He lived in the blood of all who fought. From Troy's ashes to Rome's marble halls, his presence endured. Empires could rename him, poets could soften his image, but as long as mortals killed for power, he would never die. And so Ars embraced his silence, his invisibility. He no longer needed to walk among kings or whisper into heroes' ears. He had become something greater than a god. He had become the pulse of conflict itself. The rage of humanity was his new temple. The beating war drums his eternal choir. When men fought for love, pride, revenge, or glory, Ars was there, smiling unseen. The world might forget his name, but it could never forget war. As Rome's legions marched across continents, Ars stood upon a distant hill, watching the horizon glow with the fires of conquest. He saw that mortals no longer fought to please the gods, they fought to please themselves. And that realization brought him both pride and sorrow. For he had given them this gift, this curse of conflict. They no longer needed a god of war because they had become gods of war themselves. As he gazed upon the crimson sunset, Ars felt the same chill he had felt long ago after Athena's strike. The understanding that victory always births its own defeat. He smiled then, not with joy, but with grim satisfaction. For he knew, beyond empires and names, beyond peace and politics, one truth would always remain. War is eternal, and so is ours. Time moved like the slow turning of a cosmic wheel, and the ancient fires of Greece dinned into the embers of memory. The temples that once echoed with hymns to Ars crumbled under the weight of centuries, their columns fallen, their altars buried in silence. Yet, far to the west, a new civilization began to rise, one forged not in chaos but in order, not in divine madness but in discipline. These were the Romans, a people who built their empire with method and precision, who worshipped not the storm of war but the control of it. They took the spirit of Ars and gave it a new name, Mars. To them, Mars was not destruction but destiny, not rage but reason. He was the father of their people, the protector of their fields, the guardian of their legions. And so the god of war was reborn. though his essence remained the same beneath the mask of civilization. Ars watched from the shadows of eternity, his immortal eyes burning with both curiosity and disdain. The Romans honored him, yes, but not as the Greeks once did. They did not fear his wrath or beg for mercy. They invoked his name with measured reverence. Like soldiers saluting a commander, their prayers were calm, their wars calculated. They fought not for passion, but for order. The wild god of chaos found himself replaced by a god of structure, a warrior with polished armor, not blood-stained rage. The Romans turned war into a science, and Ars could not decide whether to admire or despise them. He roamed through their marble streets unseen by mortal eyes, hearing his name chanted in the forums and temples of a Mars, guardian of Rome. The words rang hollow in his divine ears. The fire of true battle had been reduced to ceremony, and though the world praised him, Ars felt strangely forgotten. He took mortal form once more, wandering among the legions that marched to conquer distant lands. Their armor gleamed under the sun, their movements perfect, their hearts unwavering. He saw in them something both beautiful and tragic, the taming of war. They no longer trembled before death, no longer fought with fury's flame, but with iron obedience. It was war stripped of its soul, a shadow of what he once loved. The god of chaos found himself a stranger in his own domain. Yet, when he stood among them, he felt their strength, their purpose, their pride, and in that, he found a flicker of his former glory. Perhaps, he thought, even discipline could serve his will. For whether wild or measured, war was still war, and all blood spilled in battle belonged to him. Still, the name Mars echoed louder than ours. The mortals did not know they worshipped a mask. They spoke of him as the father of Romulus and Remus, the divine ancestor of Rome itself. His temples rose higher than any Greek shrine had ever stood. Priests bathed his statues in oil and crowned them with laurel, soldiers marched beneath his red banners, and every victory was credited to his divine guidance. Ars looked upon his new identity with conflicted eyes. They had made him a god of empire, a pillar of order when his essence had always been rebellion. Yet, he could not help but admire the audacity of this new people. Rome, unlike Greece, was not fragile. It devoured lands and nations, spreading its influence like wildfire. In their relentless conquest, Ars saw a reflection of his own hunger, a hunger to dominate, to leave nothing unconquered. And so, he accepted his role as Mars, even if it meant burying his true self beneath marble and myth. For centuries, he thrived in this new form. The legions carried his name into every corner of the known world. He was prayed to before every campaign, honored in triumphal parades, and feared by Rome's enemies. Yet the god himself felt a growing emptiness. The Romans worshipped victory more than war, discipline more than chaos. They fought with order, not passion. They built empires, not legends. And though Mars stood at their side, Ars slept within him, restless and unfulfilled. He missed the old days, the wild cries of Greek warriors, the unpredictable fury of mortal hearts, the madness that once gave meaning to battle. He would stand at the edge of Roman fields at night, watching the fires of their camps flicker, and whisper to himself, "Where has the storm gone? Where are the warriors who fought for glory, not empire?" The world answered him soon enough. Rome, vast and mighty, began to fracture under its own weight. Ambition turned inward. Generals once united under Mars's banner now drew swords against each other. Civil wars tore the empire apart, and for the first time in centuries, Ars felt truly alive again. The streets ran red, the Senate burned, and brother fought brother under the same flag. It was chaos reborn, beautiful and terrible. Ars cast off the polished armor of Mars and rose once more in his true form, blood-soaked, unrestrained, divine. The god of war reveled in the madness of Rome's decay, drinking in the cries of the dying like nectar. For in their fall, he saw proof that no empire could ever escape him. Even civilization, no matter how refined, always returned to its primal roots. War was the eternal equalizer, the divine reminder of mortality. But victory brought no peace to him. As the centuries passed and the empire crumbled, new beliefs began to rise. A new god was whispered of, one who preached peace, forgiveness, and love. His followers spoke not of blood and glory, but of compassion and mercy. To Ars, such words were poison. He saw temples once dedicated to him turned into churches, His statues were broken, his name cursed by those who once prayed to him. The world, it seemed, had grown tired of war. But he knew better. Mortals might reject him in name, but they could not reject what they were. For while they built altars to peace, they sharpened their swords behind closed doors. While they spoke of love, they plotted conquest. And so ours faded into shadow, unseen, unspoken, yet more alive than ever. He walked through battlefields unseen, watching new flags rise over old ruins. The gods of Olympus had grown silent, but ours endured because war endured. He no longer needed temples or sacrifices. He lived in every weapon forged, every hatred born, every empire's ambition. His name might have changed, but his essence was immortal. As he gazed upon the burning ruins of what was once Rome, he felt neither sorrow nor triumph, only certainty. Civilizations may rise under peace, but they always fall under war, and in that endless cycle, ours would always be reborn. He smiled at the irony that even when mortals thought they had replaced him, they were still his faithful servants. Every soldier who marched, every nation that fought for power, still whispered his name without knowing it, standing upon the ruins of the empire that once called him Mars. Ours lifted his gaze to the blood-red horizon. The smoke of fallen Rome rose like incense to the heavens, and he breathed it in like an offering. He knew the world would change again, that new powers would rise, new wars would come, and his name would once more take a different shape. But no matter the tongue that spoke it or the banner that bore it, he would remain the same. The eternal storm, the undying hunger, the God who thrived on the struggle that defined all life. For as long as men desired power, as long as hearts could hate, and as long as the first cry of a newborn echoed in a world already scarred by violence, ours would endure. He was not a god of mortals anymore. He was their reflection, their truth, their curse, their war everlasting. The once mighty Roman Empire had crumbled into dust and memory. Marble columns that had borne witness to the glory of Mars now lay shattered, swallowed by creeping ivy and silence. The world, it seemed, had turned its gaze away from the gods of Olympus. New faiths rose like dawn after a storm, preaching love over war, peace over conquest. To many, it was salvation. To ours, it was mockery. He watched from the ruins as the cross replaced the eagle, and hymns of mercy echoed where once battle hymns roared. The world spoke of redemption, but beneath the robes of saints and kings, he smelled the familiar scent of ambition. He knew what they denied, that peace was a mask, thin and fragile, and behind it still beat the heart of war. Ours walked unseen through the ruins of Rome, his immortal feet silent upon the cracked stones that once echoed with triumph. He saw new leaders rise not with swords, but with words, priests and popes who ruled minds instead of kingdoms. Yet even their holy power demanded blood. Crusades, they called them, wars in the name of heaven. It almost made him laugh. Mortals, he thought, had merely changed the reason for their slaughter. Where once they fought for gold and glory, now they killed for faith. "You cannot banish me," he whispered into the ears of praying soldiers. "You only changed my name." And indeed, as knights marched to the Holy Land, banners of crosses gleaming, ours followed among them, unseen but smiling. Every drop of blood spilled in the name of peace was still his victory. The Crusades were a feast for him. He walked beside kings and commoners alike, whispering courage into trembling hearts and fury into proud ones. He watched armies kneel in prayer before battle, and then rise to butcher in righteousness. The irony was divine. In their quest to serve a god of love, they had become servants of war. Ours had not vanished, he had merely evolved. No longer did he need temples or sacrifices, their faith itself was his altar. He watched knights with shining armor clash beneath the burning sun of Jerusalem, watched cities burn, watched holy men die with the same screams as heathens. The gods of Olympus may have faded, but he, the god of blood and iron, had found eternal life in human contradiction. Wherever conviction turned to violence, he was there. As centuries passed, kingdoms rose and fell like waves upon an endless sea. The sword became the quill, the battlefield turned to the throne room, but still, war ruled. Ours stood behind every throne, invisible, patient. He had learned that mortals no longer needed him to stop wars. They did it themselves. The age of faith, though wrapped in piety, was soaked in blood. Religious zeal gave way to political greed. Alliances shattered like glass. Monarchs waged wars not just for faith, but for pride, for territory, for the illusion of divine right. Ours drifted through cathedrals unseen as kings prayed for victory instead of peace. He stood behind popes who blessed armies and smiled as the word holy was used to describe slaughter. The god of war was amused. Mortals had learned to justify him with morality. "Call it justice, call it faith," he whispered, "but it is still me." He watched the birth of knights, men sworn to codes of honor, protectors of the weak, defenders of virtue. Noble ideals, yes, but beneath their shining armor he saw hearts beating with pride and vengeance. Ours admired them. They were warriors who believed their violence was righteous. To him, that was the purest form of faith, the belief that killing could be holy. He rode beside them in unseen form during their charges, his presence felt in every clash of steel. When they fell upon their enemies, swords drenched in blood under banners of purity, ours felt alive again. The age had changed, but his dominion had not. Even the most devout knights served him without knowing it. Yet, for all the wars fought in his shadow, the world began to change in ways even ours did not expect. Scholars rose from the ashes of battlefields, monks preserved knowledge, and for the first time, the written word began to rival the sword. Empires crumbled, but ideas endured. The god of war found himself walking through libraries instead of arenas, watching quills write treaties where once swords carved history. He was both intrigued and unsettled. Mortals were evolving. They had begun to dream of peace, not as a pause between wars, but as a goal. He wondered, could a world without war exist? The thought both fascinated and frightened him. For if such a world came to be, what place would there be for ours, the eternal storm? But peace was always an illusion. Beneath the calm, hatred brewed like thunder behind clouds. When nations signed treaties, ours smiled, for he knew they were promises waiting to be broken. And when the church grew corrupt, when kings turned on each other for power disguised as faith, the old fires returned. Wars of succession, wars of heresy, wars of rebellion, each one a new face of his endless reign. The god of war took many forms, a whisper in a general's ear, a spark in a rebel's heart, a shadow on the battlefield before dawn. He was in the trembling hand that drew the sword and in the roar that followed when men remembered. What they were, beasts born of conflict. He walked through the 100 Years' War, through the clash of knights and archers, through the rise of gunpowder that turned battle into chaos once more. He felt the earth tremble with explosions and smiled. Technology, too, was his new temple. Every invention designed to kill faster was a hymn in his honor. When cannons roared, ours heard his name. When muskets fired, he felt his pulse. Mortals thought they had outgrown the gods, but they were only building new ways to worship him through metal and fire. The god of war was no longer a divine figure in the sky. He was in every forge, every weapon, every hand that pulled a trigger. He had become invisible and unstoppable. As time rolled forward, faith began to falter. The church lost its iron grip, and the age of faith began to fade. But ours remained hidden in every revolution and uprising. He walked through France as peasants rose against kings, through England as crowns were broken, through every battlefield where men cried for freedom and bled for it. It amused him. They called it liberty, but it was still war. Mortals were clever. They no longer needed gods to justify violence. Now they used ideals. Freedom, justice, progress, new words for the same old thirst. "You've learned well," ours whispered to them, his laughter echoing in the smoke. "Even when you kill for peace, you serve me." And so the age of faith ended not with holiness, but with fire. Churches burned, kings fell, empires shifted. Yet through it all, ours endured, unchanged and eternal. He had witnessed humanity's evolution, but the song remained the same. Only the instruments changed. From swords to muskets, from prayers to manifestos, war remained the heartbeat of the world. And as the dawn of a new era began to rise, the age of reason, exploration, and empire, ours looked upon the horizon with a smile. He had survived the fall of gods, the rise of faith, and the death of Rome. Now, he would thrive again in a new world, one powered by ambition and greed, by discovery and conquest. For ours knew one truth above all: peace is but the preparation for the next war. The dawn of a new age rose, not of gods and faith, but of empires and machines. The old world had been burned and rebuilt, and mortals once again stood at the edge of boundless ambition. The sails of ships filled with wind and pride as nations sought to conquer the seas, to carve their names upon the face of the earth. Ours stood upon the shores, watching the sun glint off the armor of explorers and the cannons of conquerors. They spoke not of Olympus or heaven now, but of glory, progress, and destiny. Yet he knew their true master was still the same. Behind every flag planted on foreign soil, behind every discovery masked as civilization, there lurked the whisper of conquest, his eternal breath. The god of war had taken on a new face, the god of empire. He wandered unseen through bustling ports and royal courts, where maps were spread like battle plans and oceans were divided by ink. Monarchs and merchants shook hands, their greed disguised as exploration. Ours watched amused as mortals cloaked conquest in noble words, calling it expansion, civilization, destiny. But he saw through their masks. When a cannon roared from the deck of a ship, when a village burned beneath a foreign banner, when a native warrior fell defending his land, ours felt his pulse quicken. This was his new battlefield, vast, global, endless. No longer confined to kingdoms, his influence now stretched across continents. Every empire that rose under the banner of trade and progress carried his invisible blessing. He followed the empires as they spread, from the crimson flags of Britain to the golden eagles of Spain, from the Dutch ships heavy with spice to the French legions marching through Africa. The world had become his arena, but ours saw something new, the birth of industry. The hammer and anvil, once the tools of blacksmiths, became the instruments of nations. Smoke rose from the factories like incense, and machines began to breathe life into war. He stood in the shadows of iron foundries, watching sparks fly like miniature stars. The clanging of metal was music to him, and knew him for a new age. Muskets, cannons, rifles, steamships, and ironclads, each one an offering, each one a prayer whispered in steel. War was no longer born from fury alone. It was engineered, perfected, industrialized. Mortals believed they were becoming gods, controlling fire, metal, and thunder. Ours only smiled. They were not replacing him, they were becoming him. Every invention designed to destroy proved it. The Industrial Revolution, they called it, but to ours, it was the revolution of war. Factories that built carriages could build cannons. Engineers who tamed rivers could channel destruction. The same science that promised progress also promised death. Ours walked among inventors who thought themselves saviors, whispering in their ears, make it stronger, faster, deadlier. And they did. They created rifles that could kill from afar, machines that tore through flesh without mercy, ships that ruled the seas like floating fortresses. The god of war no longer needed temples. He was worshipped in laboratories. Yet even in this new age, the essence of humanity remained unchanged. Empires clashed, not for survival, but for supremacy. Nations divided the earth like hunters carving a kill, their greed disguised as divine mission. Ours followed armies as they marched under the burning sun of colonies, watching the crimson of sunset mix with the crimson of blood. He stood in jungles, deserts, and plains where unknown peoples met the guns of foreign kings. The god who had once reveled in the chaos of Greek battlefields now watched an entire world drown in his shadow. He had never been more powerful, yet, within that power, he felt a strange melancholy. War had lost its poetry. No longer was it sung by poets or honored by heroes. It had become mechanical, soulless, efficient. The fire of passion had turned into the cold steel of progress. But still, mortals glorified conquest. They built monuments to empire, paraded their victories, and told themselves they were civilizing the savage. Ours laughed at their arrogance, for he knew that no nation civilizes through blood. It only repeats the same ancient hunger under a new name. He saw empires rise like tides, Spain's glory fading, Britain's rule expanding, France's ambitions rising and falling with revolution. He walked among kings and commoners alike, knowing each believed they served destiny. In truth, they served him. Every treaty signed in greed, every ship launched for conquest, every rebellion crushed for pride, all were hymns in his eternal song. As the 19th century dawned, ours witnessed something he had never seen before, war on a scale unimaginable. Empires armed not only men but machines. Nations prepared for conflicts that would stretch beyond borders and reason. He saw alliances form, armies grow, factories work day and night forging death. It was as if the entire world was preparing for a single, magnificent offering, a sacrifice worthy of a god. Ars could feel it building, a storm on the horizon of time. The whispers of generals, the tension between nations, the greed of kings, all were threads weaving toward inevitable chaos. And the god of war waited, patient and eager, for he knew what was coming. A war not of men but of worlds. Before the storm, he walked the streets of Europe, London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and felt the heartbeat of nations that believed themselves untouchable. Art flourished, music soared, science dazzled. But beneath the beauty, he sensed restlessness. Every invention, every empire, every pitiful leader was another spark. Mortals believed they had mastered war. They had forgotten that war could never be mastered, only unleashed. And so Ars smiled, for he had seen it all before. The moment peace becomes perfect is the moment it begins to die. And when the First World War ignited, when millions marched under banners of honor and duty, when machine guns turned fields into graveyards, Ars rose once more in his full, divine form. His laughter shook the heavens as shells exploded and nations bled. "You have built me greater than Olympus," he roared, his voice lost in the thunder of cannons. For the world had finally become his masterpiece, an endless engine of destruction, worshipping progress while feeding chaos. Mortals thought they fought for nations. In truth, they fought for him. When the war ended and the earth itself seemed to mourn, Ars stood upon the smoking ruins of Europe. Millions dead, kingdoms fallen, faith shattered. Yet even in defeat, humanity whispered of rebuilding, of vengeance, of never forgetting. And Ars knew it was not over. The next war was already breathing in the ashes of the last. For war is eternal and peace is only its dream. He turned away from the trenches and whispered into the wind, "You have become me, humanity. You are my children now." And as the world limped toward another dawn, scarred, yet unrepentant, the god of war vanished into the smoke, waiting for the next age that would bear his name. The 20th century dawned with hope on its lips and fire in its heart. The world had changed, cities glowed with electric light, machines roared louder than thunder, and men believed they had conquered nature itself. Yet beneath the hum of progress, Ars felt a familiar rhythm pulsing, the heartbeat of war. He had been patient through the years of peace, watching humanity rebuild, industrialize, and dream of unity. But peace was never more than an illusion stretched over the trembling bones of ambition. Nations whispered of alliances and treaties, but their hands built bombs, their minds forged hatred, and their hearts burned with pride. Ars, silent and unseen, walked through parliaments and palaces, smiling at the naivety of mortals who thought they could contain him. They called it the modern age. He called it the age of awakening. And when the first gunfire echoed across Europe in 1914, it was as if the world had exhaled after centuries of holding its breath. The Great War had begun, and Ars rose from his long slumber. He towered unseen over battlefields, his armor glinting in the fire of explosions, his laughter lost in the thunder of artillery. The age of empires had turned into the age of annihilation. No longer did armies meet on open fields with honor and sword. Now they dug into the earth itself, living and dying in trenches that stretched like wounds across the land. Men became shadows, machines replaced valor, and death became mechanical, merciless, infinite. Ars walked through no man's land where the air itself screamed and whispered to dying soldiers, "You called for progress. This is your god." The world had never seen such slaughter. Rivers turned red, skies blackened with smoke, and the soil itself devoured generations. Ars reveled in it, not with joy but with awe. He saw humanity embrace him fully for the first time, not as a god, but as an instinct. The poets who once glorified war now wept for it, but their words were too late. The fire had spread. Empires shattered, monarchies fell, and the old world collapsed into chaos. Yet, even in ruin, mortals swore that this would be the war to end all wars. Ars only smiled. He knew better. War did not end, it evolved. And so, when peace was declared, when treaties were signed with trembling hands, he felt no defeat. For within that peace, he already heard the seeds of vengeance growing. The 1930s came like the calm before a storm. Ars wandered through nations rebuilding themselves with steel and pride. He saw leaders rise, men with voices that could move crowds like tides, feeding on anger and despair. He recognized them instantly, mortals possessed by his spirit. They spoke of glory, destiny, purification, empire, old words dressed in modern tongues. He stood behind them as they rallied millions, unseen yet guiding. "Build your armies," he whispered. "Reclaim your honor." And they did. The factories that once made cars now forged tanks. The planes that once carried passengers were turned into weapons of fire. Humanity, restless and blind, was once again sharpening its own destruction. Ours could feel it in the air, the tension, the hatred, the inevitable explosion of chaos. Then came 1939, the year the earth itself seemed to shudder. When the first bombs fell upon Poland, ours returned to full strength. The Second World War was not merely his rebirth, it was his ascension. He was everywhere, in the roar of engines, in the fire of bombs, in the fear that clung to cities at night. The world had become his temple again. Millions marched, millions died, and the gods of peace fell silent. Nations burned across continents, and the oceans turned into graveyards. Ours walked beside soldiers storming beaches, whispered courage to pilots diving into enemy skies, and laughed as cities turned to ashes. He had never been so powerful, never so complete. Humanity no longer needed myth to summon him. They had science. War had become divine through technology. But even for ours, the horror of this war was different. He saw not only courage, but cruelty beyond imagination, the machinery of death turned inward, the slaughter of the innocent justified by ideology. For the first time, he felt a strange chill within himself, as if even his immortal soul trembled at what humanity had become. War was no longer about honor or power. It had become systematic, industrial, detached. He watched the rise of the camps, the smoke that darkened the skies not from battle but from genocide. This was war stripped of all its masks, pure destruction, pure madness, and ours realized something terrifying. Mortals had surpassed him. They no longer needed a god of war. They had become gods of death themselves. When the world ended in flame, cities burning under atomic suns, ours stood in the silent glow of Hiroshima. For the first time in eternity, he did not smile. The bomb was the purest form of his existence, the union of intellect and destruction, and yet it filled him with unease. He had always been war's master, but now war had mastered him. Humanity had discovered power that rivaled the divine, and they wielded it with trembling hands. "You've become me," he whispered, his voice carried through the radioactive wind. "And soon you will surpass even me." The age of the gods was truly over. Ours no longer ruled over mortals. They had inherited his throne. In the ashes of the war, peace returned, but it was fragile, a mirror waiting to crack. The nations built alliances, walls, and weapons more terrible than ever before. The Cold War began, not with swords or soldiers, but with fear, an invisible war of minds, of power, of waiting. Ours found it strange. The battlefield had moved from trenches to politics, from land to ideology. Yet the spirit was the same. He watched men live under the shadow of annihilation, knowing one command could end the world. It was war without fighting, violence without blood, a quieter worship of his essence. He had become the ghost of every missile, the echo behind every speech of defiance. Though invisible, he was omnipresent. The god of war had become the god of tension. Still, not all wars froze in silence. He walked through the jungles of Vietnam, the deserts of the Middle East, the cold mountains of Afghanistan. He saw nations wage proxy wars in the name of peace and freedom. Both words he found deliciously ironic. Technology had changed, but the song remained the same, young men dying for old men's pride, civilians suffering for distant politics, and the world learning nothing. He saw the rise of revolutions, guerrilla fighters, and weapons that could destroy a city from the sky. The earth had become small, but its violence infinite. And everywhere, in every conflict, in every act of vengeance or defense, ours was there, not as a god demanding worship, but as a truth that could not be erased. He began to understand his own immortality in a new way. He no longer needed temples, names, or prayers. He lived in the human soul, in fear, in anger, in ambition. He was not above them anymore. He was within them. When a soldier raised a rifle, ours guided his hand. When a nation declared war, his heartbeat echoed in their drums. He had transcended divinity and become instinct. He realized that even if his name faded from history, even if no one remembered Olympus, he would never die. For as long as humans loved, they would hate. As long as they built, they would destroy. And as long as they lived, they would kill. The 20th century closed with smoke, rubble, and uneasy peace. Empires were gone, but war remained, transformed, disguised, modernized. Ours stood atop a silent battlefield at dusk, surrounded by rusted tanks and forgotten flags. The wind carried whispers of the dead, and he listened not with sorrow, but with weary understanding. He had seen civilizations rise and fall, gods forgotten, empires crumble. But one thing had never changed, the human need to fight. He gazed at the blood-colored sunset and smiled faintly. Even without me, he said softly, you will continue, because you are me. The god of war turned his gaze toward the horizon of a new millennium, a world of satellites, computers, and silent weapons. The wars of the future would not be fought with swords or tanks, but with data, drones, and lies. And ours, eternal and adaptive, was ready to take his new form once more. For he knew, as he always had, that peace was just the shadow of the next storm. And wherever that storm began, in the heart, in the code, or in the sky, he would be there, waiting. The world had changed again. The thunder of cannons had faded into the hum of servers, the roar of engines replaced by the quiet pulse of machines. Ours, the eternal god of war, walked through a new battlefield, one without borders, where weapons were invisible and soldiers wore no armor. It was the dawn of the digital age, the age of information and illusion. Nations no longer needed swords to conquer, they needed data. Battles were fought not in trenches, but in cyberspace, not with armies, but with algorithms. Yet ours felt more alive than ever, for war in its essence had not died, it had evolved. Humanity had merely learned to wage it in silence. He roamed unseen through the flickering glow of screens, through satellites orbiting the Earth, through cables pulsing beneath oceans. The world was now connected by invisible threads of power and deceit, and ours pulled at every strand. He saw governments spy on their own people, hackers wage unseen wars, corporations fight for dominance with numbers instead of bullets. He saw truth turned into a weapon, lies sharpened into blades. The battlefield was no longer land or sea. It was the human mind. Ours smiled, for this was a kind of warfare even he had never imagined. It was elegant, bloodless, and endless. He whispered into the ears of leaders, of influencers, of digital kings who ruled with words instead of armies, control their thoughts, and you control their world. And they obeyed, unknowingly serving him still. Wars still raged, of course, in deserts, in cities, in the shadows of power. Drones flew where soldiers once marched, striking from skies unseen. Satellites guided missiles across continents with the precision of a heartbeat. Machines now killed in his name, programmed by those who thought themselves gods. Ours walked among the operators, men and women in cold, sterile rooms, staring at screens as lives ended thousands of miles away. He leaned close and whispered, "It's still you who pulls the trigger." And though they told themselves it was just duty, Ours knew better. The thrill of control, the illusion of power, the justification of violence, it was all the same as it had been since the dawn of time. The form had changed, but the heart remained constant. Humanity had simply made war more efficient. The god of war began to see his reflection everywhere, in the rise of nationalism, in the manipulation of media, in the fear that spread faster than disease. The world had grown smaller, yet more divided. He watched as countries tore themselves apart with politics, as societies turned brother against brother without a single weapon fired. "Perfect," he murmured, standing amid digital riots that flashed across screens. "You've learned to destroy without blood." It was a new kind of battlefield. Ideological, psychological, emotional. Words had become bombs, opinions had become bullets, and the truth itself had become a casualty. Ours no longer needed to whisper rage into hearts. The internet did it for him. Every argument, every outrage, every division was another offering at his invisible altar. He drifted through the chaos of the 21st century, the age of terror, of protest, of endless noise. He watched the towers fall in fire, the wars of revenge that followed, the world spinning in fear and fury. He saw nations claim righteousness as they unleashed destruction, each side convinced that justice was theirs. And in that symmetry of hate, Ars saw perfection. Humanity no longer fought for gods or kings or even land. They fought for belief, for ideology, for pride. Wars of religion had given way to wars of opinion, and both were infinite. You have become divine, he said softly, gazing upon a world that burned without knowing why. You have become me. Even peace had become a kind of war. The struggle for resources, for dominance in economy, in technology. In narrative, all were new weapons in an ancient game. Ars saw wars fought over oil, over water, over data. He saw the world fracture into alliances and enemies that changed faster than the seasons. He saw cyber attacks crippling nations, currencies collapsing, misinformation spreading like wildfire. Mortals thought they were building a future. Ars knew they were building his new temple, a digital Olympus made of firewalls and fear. He did not stand atop mountains anymore. He stood in networks, in systems, in the pulse of every device connected to the grid. The god of war had become omnipresent, an unseen force in the circuitry of civilization. Yet even as his power spread, something stirred within him, a strange melancholy. The world no longer needed rage or honor to fight. Battles were fought by machines, decisions made by codes, deaths counted like statistics. The human spirit that once roared with courage and chaos was now quieted by screens. Ars felt it, the absence of glory, the emptiness of modern conflict. There were no heroes, no songs, no eyes that met death with defiance. Just distant explosions and hollow victories. For the first time, the god of war missed the humanity of battle. He missed the roar of men who fought not for politics, but for survival, the raw passion that once defined his existence. The new wars were efficient, but soulless. He wondered if this, too, was the destiny of all gods to become ghosts in their own creations. But even in that emptiness, Ars found renewal. He saw the rise of new forms of warfare, digital rebellion, psychological dominance, biological manipulation. He walked unseen through laboratories where weapons were born not of metal, but of gene and virus. He saw disease unleashed like armies, fear spreading faster than fire. And when nations turned suspicion upon one another, when conspiracy replaced truth, Ars smiled again. "You will never change," he whispered. "You only evolve." He understood now that war did not belong to weapons or armies. It lived in every conflict, every rivalry, every act of defiance. As long as there was division, as long as there was competition, war would never die, and neither would he. He began to take a new form, not as a god of battle, but as a god of control. His voice no longer thundered. It whispered through trends, through propaganda, through algorithms that divided millions with invisible precision. Humanity had built him into the system itself. Ars had become the rhythm of power, the invisible tension that kept nations armed, economies competing, societies divided. And as he watched the world grow restless again, whispers of new wars, new crises, new enemies, he knew the storm was returning. The next great war would not begin with a shout, but with silence. A single code, a single decision, a single spark in a digital void. At night, when cities slept and the internet never did, Ars stood atop skyscrapers, gazing at the lights below. Each one represented a mind, a connection, a potential conflict. The god of war smiled, his reflection flickering across countless screens. "You've built me into your world," he said softly, "and I will never leave it." He knew that no matter how advanced humanity became, no matter how much they claimed to love peace, their hearts would always beat with fear and pride. The twin drums of war. He was no longer just the god of blood and battle. He was the god of every tension that held civilization together. And as the world moved toward a future more uncertain than ever, Ars felt something ancient stirring again. The winds of unrest, the pulse of rebellion, the whisper of chaos in the circuitry of order. He raised his eyes to the electric sky and smiled. The world might have forgotten his name, but it could never forget his nature. For in every code of conflict, in every spark of hate, in every shadow of fear, Ars lived on. And as the next age dawned, brighter and darker than all before, he whispered the words that had echoed since the beginning of time. War will never end. It only changes its face. The world had entered an age unlike any Ars had seen before, not of fire or steel, but of shadows. Once, he had ruled over battlefields drenched in blood, over the cries of soldiers and the clash of blades. Now, He walked among the hum of digital illusions where truth and lies twisted together like smoke. It was an era when no one knew who the enemy was, and that uncertainty became the deadliest weapon of all. Ars could feel the pulse of deception beating across the globe. The whispers of misinformation spreading through screens faster than any army could march. Nations no longer waged war with armies, they waged war with narratives. Truth had become subjective, molded like clay by those with power. It was chaos perfected, and Ars stood in the center of it, not as a conqueror, but as the architect of an invisible battlefield. He walked through the veins of the internet like a ghost of electricity, watching humans drown in endless waves of opinion and outrage. Every word, every post, every rumor became ammunition. A single falsehood could topple governments, ignite revolutions, or destroy lives. The god of war no longer needed to summon armies. He needed only to whisper an idea. Ars had discovered the evolution of his oldest weapon: confusion. In the old days, men fought because they knew their enemies. Now, they fought because they could not tell who their enemies were. People turned on their friends, their families, their neighbors, each convinced they were defending justice. He watched with fascination as society fractured into echo chambers, each one shouting louder, none listening. "You are your own soldiers now," he murmured, as the world tore itself apart in argument and division. Power had become invisible, and so had the wars. Hidden empires of influence stretched across the web, run by unseen hands. Corporations shaped thought, politicians manufactured realities, and algorithms learned to feed the anger that burned most brightly. Ars watched as mortals surrendered willingly to manipulation, as their minds became the new battleground. He smiled grimly, for though they claimed to hate war, they craved conflict in their own ways. Outrage had become entertainment. Violence was replaced by spectacle, and every argument was a duel. Humanity no longer fought for survival, but for validation. Ars saw the irony clearly. They had outgrown the sword, but not the desire to wound. He saw in their eyes the same flame that once burned in the hearts of warriors, the need to conquer, to prove, to dominate. And though they wielded words instead of weapons, the destruction was no less complete. The god wandered through cities that gleamed with light but reeked of fear. The streets were quiet, but the networks roared. He saw people glued to screens, searching for truth but finding only mirrors. "You have blinded yourselves," he said softly, walking unseen among them. "You see everything, and yet nothing at all." He watched leaders rise through manipulation and fall through exposure, saw truth twisted until even honesty looked like deceit. The more humans tried to uncover reality, the more lost they became in its illusions. The world no longer needed armies to enslave itself. It had built its own prison from lies and fear. Ars admired the elegance of it all. Once, his wars had left scars on the land, now they left scars on the soul. He walked into the heart of media, where stories were no longer told, but engineered. Here, he felt his new temple take shape. Each studio, each newsroom, each feed was an altar to distortion. He whispered into microphones, bent words with the weight of temptation. Truth, he realized, was the most fragile weapon ever forged. It could shatter under pressure, and when it did, its fragments cut deeper than any blade. He saw wars born from rumors, revolutions from deceit, movements fueled by half-truths. The gods of old had once battled for worship, now they fought for belief. And belief, Ars learned, was far deadlier than faith. Belief did not require truth, only conviction. The god of war found new allies among those who mastered deception. Propagandists, influencers, leaders who ruled with charisma and confusion, they were his modern generals. They conquered not through destruction but persuasion. Ars stood beside them as they crafted speeches and orchestrated chaos. He saw them ignite nations with rhetoric, summon armies with lies. "You fight beautifully," he told them, his voice echoing through their subconscious. And they did, not knowing whose will they served. The battlefield was now within the human mind, and victory was measured in perception, not territory. He had once been worshipped through blood sacrifices, now he was praised through attention. Every like, every click, every share. Another offering to the eternal god of conflict. As centuries of warfare evolved into centuries of confusion, Ars began to feel something both ancient and new, omnipresence. He was everywhere, in the news, in debates, in silent mistrust between friends. Humanity had become his vessel, each thought a soldier, each word a weapon. The god of war no longer needed to exist in form, he existed in function. And yet, amid this infinite chaos, he sensed another enemy rising, silence. In a world drowning in noise, silence became rebellion. Truth-seekers, the few who sought clarity, began to resist the fog. Ars watched them with curiosity. Could truth still stand against him? Could understanding destroy conflict? He doubted it, for even those who sought peace often disagreed on what peace meant. That, too, was war. He began to see the consequences of his influence. Nations crumbled under internal strife. Empires of misinformation devoured themselves. Trust, the final thread that bound humanity, began to snap. Families divided, societies polarized, reality fragmented. And in the ruins of certainty, fear took root. Fear of being wrong, fear of being controlled, fear of each other. Ars knew then that he had achieved something no god before him had done. He had made war eternal, not through weapons, but through confusion. No ceasefire could stop it. No treaty could define it. War had become the natural state of thought, invisible, personal, constant. He wandered through darkened cities, through riots lit by screens instead of torches, and felt an old satisfaction stirring within him. The age of shadows had become his masterpiece. Humanity now destroyed itself with words, and every sentence was a spark. He watched arguments grow into movements, lies become law, and chaos disguised as progress. You wanted freedom. He whispered into the storm, and I gave it to you. But freedom without truth is war without end. And the world trembled not from armies, but from uncertainty. Yet even the god of war began to wonder. What would come after this? If truth had fallen, if chaos had become the norm, what would humanity build upon such ruins? Would they find a new form of order, or drown forever in their own illusions? Ars stood upon the horizon of a new dawn, the glow of 1,000 screens flickering like stars around him. He had seen empires fall, gods fade, and civilizations crumble. But this was different. The war for the mind was endless because it lived within every living soul. He closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of 1 billion hearts beating in disharmony, and smiled. You are my children, he said softly. Born of confusion, bound by conflict, the age of shadows was his legacy, not of swords, not of blood, but of the fall of truth itself. And as dawn broke over a world to blind it to see it, Ars turned his gaze to the future, for even in darkness, new wars were always waiting to be born. For ages, Ars had believed himself eternal, the unchallenged embodiment of conflict, the pulse of every battle, the whisper in every violent heart. Yet as the world shifted deeper into chaos, he began to sense something strange in the air, the scent of power not his own. It started as a faint vibration, a ripple through the web of influence he commanded, like a tremor beneath a battlefield. He followed it across continents, through digital networks and secret chambers, and found something that made even the god of war hesitate. Humanity, in its hunger for power, had created new gods not through worship, but through obsession. Greed, deception, control, and fear had evolved beyond mere emotions. They had taken shape, carved from the essence of collective belief. The modern age had not killed the gods, it had replaced them. And Ars, for the first time since the dawn of Olympus, was not alone in his dominion. He encountered Mammon, the god of greed, rising from the smoke of cities where profit mattered more than life. Mammon's temples were glass towers, his priests were investors, his sacrifices were the broken dreams of the poor. Ars watched as nations went to war not for honor, but for resources, for currency, for control. Greed had become an army without loyalty. Mammon smiled at Ars, his golden eyes cold. You still fight for chaos, he said. I fight for purpose. The world doesn't bleed anymore, Ars, it buys. The god of war clenched his fists, realizing the truth in those words. Battles were fought now in markets, in systems, in silent numbers, wars without blood, but with the same devastation. Mammon was winning, and his empire stretched farther than Ars could see. Next came Apate, the goddess of deception, reborn from the lies humanity told itself. She danced across screens, her voice sweet as honey, her face ever-changing. Ars watched her sway the world with illusions, turning truth into myth, myth into fact, until no one could tell the difference. You see, she whispered as she passed him in the dark. They no longer need swords, Ars. They destroy themselves with belief. Her laughter was like broken glass, echoing through the minds of men and women who trusted shadows more than reality. Ars tried to strike her, but his blows met only mist. She was everywhere, in politics, in media, in whispers between friends. Aphrodite had no army, yet she ruled the world with lies so beautiful that even gods could be deceived. Ars realized that the battlefield he once controlled was now a theater, and he was no longer directing the play. Then came Phobos, his own son, the god of fear. Born from Ares' own blood, Phobos had grown into something monstrous. Once a companion of battle, he was now the soul of every panic that gripped the world. His form shifted, sometimes a shadow behind a soldier's eyes, sometimes a virus spreading unseen. "Father," Phobos said, his voice echoing from every direction, "you gave me life to terrify men, but they have surpassed me. Their fear feeds itself now." And it was true. Humanity's fear no longer needed Ares' spark. It burned on its own, consuming everything. Phobos ruled through uncertainty, through headlines, through silence. Even Ars felt his chill. For the first time, the god of war wondered if he had lost command over his own legacy. Fear had become the new general of humankind, and Ars stood watching as his own creation became his greatest rival. And beyond them all loomed Kera, the spirit of destruction itself, no longer divine, no longer bound by Olympus or underworld. Kera was pure annihilation, born from humanity's will to erase what it could not control. She was the hum of nuclear power, the code of a virus, the hand that pressed every red button. Ars saw her once, walking through the ruins of a city torn by both greed and fear. "You built me," she whispered, her voice like ash. "You taught them how to burn. Now they do not need you." Her words pierced deeper than any blade. Ars, who once gloried in carnage, realized that destruction had evolved beyond him. It no longer needed gods, only humans. The god of war stood amidst the pantheon of his own making and felt something he had never felt before: insignificance. He had once believed himself immortal, essential, eternal. But now he saw that war no longer required a god. Humanity had learned his lessons too well. They had taken his chaos, his fury, his ambition, and industrialized it. They no longer needed to worship Ars to serve him. The world itself had become his altar, every act of conflict a silent prayer to what he once represented. And yet, he was fading, not from weakness but from perfection. His creation had become self-sustaining. That realization burned like a blade through his divine soul. Still, Ars was not one to surrender. "If I am forgotten," he growled, "then I will remind them what I am." The earth trembled beneath his wrath as he rose from the digital shadows and appeared once more in mortal form, not as a phantom of the net, but as the old god of battle forged in fire and blood. He walked among nations on the brink, his presence unseen, but his influence felt in every heartbeat. Wars erupted in places where peace had long been promised. Old rivalries reignited, forgotten hatreds resurfaced. The air filled once again with the scent of smoke and steel. Ars wanted the world to remember, not the lies, not the fear, but the pure chaos of true war. And as humanity stumbled once more toward destruction, he smiled, for this was the rhythm he had always known. But even as he unleashed this chaos, the other gods moved. Mammon tightened his grip through economic collapse. Aphrodite twisted narratives until truth itself seemed treasonous. Phobos spread panic through the airwaves, through the silence of the night. And Kera, she waited, always waiting, for the final spark. Ars realized then that the war he had begun was no longer his alone. The battlefield had expanded beyond even divine comprehension. It was no longer mortals against mortals, nor gods against gods. It was existence against itself. Every system, every belief, every emotion now fought for dominance. War had become universal. Ars stood on the edge of this apocalypse, watching the world tremble beneath the weight of its own creation. He saw empires collapsing under invisible wars, digital tempests tearing nations apart, gods devouring gods in an endless cycle of power. Perhaps, he whispered to the wind, this is what it means to be eternal, to watch your reflection destroy you. Yet even in this moment of despair, a spark remained. Ars knew that as long as life existed, as long as there was struggle, his essence would never truly fade. For war was not evil, nor good, it was simply inevitable. It was the heartbeat of existence itself. And so, as the new gods fought for control of the world ours had built, the old god of war watched in silence, not defeated, but transformed. The time had come for him to face his own creation, not as a ruler, but as a witness. The war of gods had begun, and Ars stood in the center of it, no longer the master of chaos, but its oldest memory. He raised his gaze to the burning sky and whispered to the gods of greed, deception, fear, and destruction, "You were born from me. But remember, all wars end where they begin." For ages, Ars had believed himself eternal, the unchallenged embodiment of conflict, the pulse of every battle, the whisper in every violent heart. Yet as the world shifted deeper into chaos, he began to sense something strange in the air, the scent of power not his own. It started as a faint vibration, a ripple through the web of influence he commanded, like a tremor beneath a battlefield. He followed it across continents, through digital networks and secret chambers, and found something that made even the god of war hesitate. Humanity, in its hunger for power, had created new gods not through worship, but through obsession. Greed, deception, control, and fear had evolved beyond mere emotions. They had taken shape. Carved from the essence of collective belief, the modern age had not killed the gods, it had replaced them. And Ars, for the first time since the dawn of Olympus, was not alone in his dominion. He encountered Mammon, the god of greed, rising from the smoke of cities where profit mattered more than life. Mammon's temples were glass towers, his priests were investors, his sacrifices were the broken dreams of the poor. Ars watched as nations went to war not for honor, but for resources, for currency, for control. Greed had become an army without loyalty. Mammon smiled at Ars, his golden eyes cold. "You still fight for chaos," he said. "I fight for purpose. The world doesn't bleed anymore, Ars, it buys." The god of war clenched his fists, realizing the truth in those words. Battles were fought now in markets, in systems, in silent numbers, wars without blood, but with the same devastation. Mammon was winning, and his empire stretched farther than Ars could see. Next came Aphrodite, the goddess of deception, reborn from the lies humanity told itself. She danced across screens, her voice sweet as honey, her face ever-changing. Ars watched her sway the world with illusions, turning truth into myth, myth into fact, until no one could tell the difference. "You see," she whispered as she passed him in the dark, "they no longer need swords, Ars. They destroy themselves with belief." Her laughter was like broken glass, echoing through the minds of men and women who trusted shadows more than reality. Ars tried to strike her, but his blows met only mist. She was everywhere, in politics, in media, in whispers between friends. Aphrodite had no army, yet she ruled the world with lies so beautiful that even gods could be deceived. Ars realized that the battlefield he once controlled was now a theater, and he was no longer directing the play. Then came Phobos, his own son, the god of fear. Born from Ares' own blood, Phobos had grown into something monstrous. Once a companion of battle, he was now the soul of every panic that gripped the world. His form shifted, sometimes a shadow behind a soldier's eyes, sometimes a virus spreading unseen. "Father," Phobos said, his voice echoing from every direction, "you gave me life to terrify men, but they have surpassed me. Their fear feeds itself now." And it was true. Humanity's fear no longer needed Ares' spark. It burned on its own, consuming everything. Phobos ruled through uncertainty, through headlines, through silence. Even Ars felt his chill. For the first time, the god of war wondered if he had lost command over his own legacy. Fear had become the new general of humankind, and Ars stood watching as his own creation became his greatest rival. And beyond them all loomed Kera, the spirit of destruction itself, no longer divine, no longer bound by Olympus or underworld. Kera was pure annihilation, born from humanity's will to erase what it could not control. She was the hum of nuclear power, the code of a virus, the hand that pressed every red button. Ars saw her once, walking through the ruins of a city torn by both greed and fear. "You built me," she whispered, her voice like ash. "You taught them how to burn. Now they do not need you." Her words pierced deeper than any blade. "Ars, who once gloried in carnage, realized that destruction had evolved beyond him. It no longer needed gods, only humans. The god of war stood amidst the pantheon of his own making and felt something he had never felt before: insignificance. He had once believed himself immortal, essential, eternal. But now he saw that war no longer required a god. Humanity had learned his lessons too well. They had taken his chaos, his fury, his ambition, and industrialized it. They no longer needed to worship ours to serve him. The world itself had become his altar, every act of conflict a silent prayer to what he once represented. And yet, he was fading not from weakness but from perfection. His creation had become self-sustaining. That realization burned like a blade through his divine soul. Still, ours was not one to surrender. "If I am forgotten," he growled, "then I will remind them what I am." The earth trembled beneath his wrath as he rose from the digital shadows and appeared once more in mortal form, not as a phantom of the net, but as the old god of battle forged in fire and blood. He walked among nations on the brink, his presence unseen, but his influence felt in every heartbeat. Wars erupted in places where peace had long been promised. Old rivalries reignited, forgotten hatreds resurfaced. The air filled once again with the scent of smoke and steel. Ours wanted the world to remember, not the lies, not the fear, but the pure chaos of true war. And as humanity stumbled once more toward destruction, he smiled, for this was the rhythm he had always known. But even as he unleashed this chaos, the other gods moved. Mammon tightened his grip through economic collapse. Apate twisted narratives until truth itself seemed treasonous. Phobos spread panic through the airwaves, through the silence of the night. And Kera, she waited, always waiting, for the final spark. Ars realized then that the war he had begun was no longer his alone. The battlefield had expanded beyond even divine comprehension. It was no longer mortals against mortals, nor gods against gods. It was existence against itself. Every system, every belief, every emotion now fought for dominance. War had become universal. Ars stood on the edge of this apocalypse, watching the world tremble beneath the weight of its own creation. He saw empires collapsing under invisible wars, digital tempests tearing nations apart, gods devouring gods in an endless cycle of power. Perhaps, he whispered to the wind, this is what it means to be eternal, to watch your reflection destroy you. Yet even in this moment of despair, a spark remained. Ars knew that as long as life existed, as long as there was struggle, his essence would never truly fade. For war was not evil, nor good, it was simply inevitable. It was the heartbeat of existence itself. And so, as the new gods fought for control of the world Ars had built, the old god of war watched in silence, not defeated, but transformed. The time had come for him to face his own creation, not as a ruler, but as a witness. The war of gods had begun, and Ars stood in the center of it, no longer the master of chaos, but its oldest memory. He raised his gaze to the burning sky and whispered to the gods of greed, deception, fear, and destruction, you were born from me. But remember, all wars end where they begin.